Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
Hi, this is Andy Stricker. I am currently the Dean of Admission and Financial Aid at Connecticut College, located in New London, Connecticut. I've also worked in athletics and admissions at Kalamazoo College, Beloit College, Ursinus College, and Guilford College in Greensboro, North Carolina.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a wellness coach at the Keenan Flagler Business School at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. This week in the news, we'll have part 2 of what'll be an 8 or 9-parter on all things athletics recruiting, and college admissions. Julia will join me for a question from a listener. Part 3 of 4, Carlynn Greene's interview on how to win out external or outside scholarships. And Kevin Newton is back. And we're looking at your options if you want to go to London, England. Friends, we're having a multi-part series with Andy Stricker, Director of Admissions at Connecticut College. And we were starting out talking about pre-reads, but we've expanded. We're talking about a number of things just related to athletic recruiting and how it works. Can't tell you exactly how many parts it's going to be because we haven't finished. We're doing it in multiple segments. But I hope you enjoy it as much as I am enjoying it. And this is part 2 of whatever. If you missed part 1, I think it's worth your while to go back and check it out. Listen and enjoy.
I know coaches that will not submit a pre-read until they have vetted a student athlete and are certain that the student athlete would contribute to the program. I also have known coaches that will submit a vast number of pre-reads, get the academic assessment information back, figure out who's in the neighborhood, and then go through an additional process of vetting. So I don't think we want to make an assumption regarding assessment on an athletic side simply because a coach asked for a pre-read.
And just with students I'm working with this year, I've seen it done both ways just this year.
Exactly.
So is it a fair question for a student who's told, I'd like to bring you forward for a pre-read, to say, what does that mean? Is that a fair question for the student to ask that?
I think that's 110% a fair question, 100% of the time. I think that students and families should ask plenty of questions in the admission process. Like, are you doing a ton of pre-reads, or have we already been vetted? You know, I think it's totally fair to ask those questions on the front end, 100%.
And let's get into a few more of those questions a little later, because I've got some I want to fire away at you.
Sure.
But let's talk about who does pre-reads. Who's doing pre-reads out there? Because not every school does pre-reads, right? You got different situation with LOIs and how it works at D1, most D1s.
I think the further up the food chain of selectivity you go, the more likely you are to run into an academic pre-read. You know, simply because if an institution is selective, moderately selective, highly selective, or super selective, they have more academically qualified applicants than they have spaces for. So the more into that selective realm you get, the more you're going to run into the request and the requirement to do a pre-read. And I'm so rusty on NCAA regs. I remember when you had to submit stuff to the NCAA clearinghouse to make sure that you were, pre-cleared to be scholarship eligible. Does that even still exist anymore, Mark? Tell me, does it?
Well, they've dropped the test score requirement.
Correct, which is good.
Yeah.
Smart.
They used to have that test score requirement that they got rid of that during COVID, and for the foreseeable future.
But by and large, we at Con, we operate in a fairly selective admission environment. And therefore, almost all the prospective student athletes that we are engaged with, and almost all of the peer institutions that students are also looking at, are it's almost exclusively going to be some kind of academic pre-read, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and you'll see that right at your academic D3s. Not as much at D1, although you see it at like IVs. And once again, I think your point, like the highly selectives,
Yeah,
it's not enough just because the coach wants them. They still need to
yeah.
make it through the admission process, where for other sports, sometimes.
I'm fairly certain that Stanford and Duke and
Yeah.
Wake and Vanderbilt, the highly selective D1s,
Yeah.
are still doing some kind of pre-read on the front end, just to make sure that the coach isn't spending an inordinate amount of time and energy and spending money on an official visit for a student that hasn't gotten a pre-clearance from the admission office.
Yeah. In fact, at Westtown, we had several players go to Duke for basketball.
Yes, you
And
did.
you probably
Yes,
know
you
that. You
did.
follow
Yes.
that. You
I
follow
did
that.
follow that. Seth has built a really
Yes.
good program there, and
Yes, he sure
it's a
has.
who's who of Division I recruits down there at Westtown. That's for sure.
I know. But the reason I brought it up is it was not uncommon for Christoph Gutentag to call Susan Tree directly.
Yeah,
And to talk about the players, to do a little bit of mining about them before they admitted them.
absolutely. 100%. We do that with coaches. We will do that at times with high school counselors that we have relationships with. In fact, there's actually a student athlete who I did a pre-read on, and there were some question marks, and the student came in for an interview and sat down with me for 45 minutes. And that was what convinced me that we were going to go that route. And the student actually graduated with a 3.3 GPA, is out there in the world with a great job and killing it with an environmental engineering firm. So
Love it.
yeah, we'll do whatever we need to do to assess as to whether the student has the academic characteristics to succeed at a particular institution.
Well, let's get into that a little bit. Let's get into some different models you've seen. You've already delineated a very important one, which is for some schools, they've already vetted the athlete from a talent standpoint, and the pre-read is more about, can you get through the academic hurdles,
Right.
where others want to vet you first academically, and then they'll do the talent eval later.
Right.
But can you talk about any different models you've seen out there in terms of what's involved in the pre-read? And I have some questions for you about some different things I've seen, but I'd love for you to just paint a picture overall.
It's an interesting question, because each institution has the right to do a pre-read however they best see fit. Some institutions, it's just sort of baseline, bare bones information. Send me your transcript as of the conclusion of your 5th semester, which would be 9th grade, 10th grade, and half of 11th grade. Just to get a sense. Okay, all right, yeah, they're taking half decent classes and they can do the work. Okay, we're great. We're at a place that's a little bit of the middle of the road, which is we want to see full transcript from 9th, 10th, and 11th grade. We want to see senior course selection. If a student has test scores, please send them in, because we'll evaluate them and give you some advice as to whether you should go SAT, ACT, or test optional / no tests. And there's some institutions that will ask for all of that and then ask for a writing sample as well, because their evaluation, at least when it comes to a pre-read, they try to mimic what they're going to do with the overall evaluation of the application, which involves a level of holistic. We want to read the essay. We want to read this extra essay, figure out personal characteristics, because that factors into our formula a little bit as well. So I've heard stories where some pre-reads this summer, are extraordinarily involved, where they're asking for 2 or 3 short answer questions from a particular student athlete just to do a pre-read. So you'll see it all across the spectrum in terms of level of requirements that are involved.
Yeah, the last couple of years I've worked with students looking at Amherst, as you know very well, right, in your NESCAC conference, right?
Yep.
And they've had to do 2 different separate, very similar, like to the custom prompts, that you get as part of the pre-read.
Exactly.
Have you seen interviews ever be part of a pre-read?
Officially, no.
Mm-hmm.
Informally, yes.
Explain that. Like you want to meet someone and chit chat a little bit for 10 minutes, that kind of thing, and they don't know it's an interview, but you're getting sized up?
Well, what I would say is this. There are certain places that I have been, and I think many institutions live in this zone where they believe that character counts. And sometimes it's more difficult to assess character in a static document that lives on your computer screen. And whether an admission office requests an interview or a coach says the character of this particular student athlete is off the charts, and sitting down with this student will give you a glimpse to his or her or their character, and it would be of value to you. I think both exist, and I think many admissions offices are open to both. And I have done that on multiple occasions at multiple stops along my sort of admission journey, where sitting down and having a conversation with a particular student athlete allowed me to visualize that, one of the phrases that gets thrown about a fair amount, but sometimes makes a lot of sense is, it's not the size of the dog in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the dog. That there are plenty of students who have such a determined will to succeed that given a challenge, they will overcome that challenge with all of their effort. And therefore, there are plenty of students who have appeared in front of me and I've said, wow, character here is off the charts. This is going to subtly influence a pre-read.
That's great.
So it happens.
I want to ask you about something that I've seen done very differently at different places and get your thoughts.
Sure.
Test scores. So I have seen for test optional schools where they're test optional for admissions for regular applicants and they're completely test optional for athletes. And then I've also seen test optional schools where the coach has communicated to students that I've been working with, we say we're test optional, but I'm going to tell you, it's really going to help me a lot if you could submit some test scores.
Right.
Is that your experience as well?
Anecdotally, 100%. 100%. We're test optional across the board. We'll do a pre-read with a transcript, senior classes, school profile, and the test scores are optional. If the test scores are submitted, we'll look at them and give some advice to the student athlete as to whether, hey, we think you should submit these scores or you should waive these scores. And we will do that for regular students in addition to student athletes. We want to make sure that whatever we're doing for student athletes, we're also doing for regular applicants here at Con, which we're really good about. But I've known test optional institutions that have required test scores at the point of a pre-read, which is interesting, but that's their policy.
Yeah.
And they have gone through internal deliberations and dialogues, which have led them to that place. And I'm sure they have well thought out reasons why they do that. We have not had that dialogue here, and I don't foresee us moving in that direction. But you'll see the full spectrum where they're going to be required, even though the test optional. There are a handful of schools now that are back to requiring test scores. Okay, great. You have to submit a test score. We're totally test optional at the pre-read and at the admission stage. So whether a student athlete sends them or not, we don't care. And we don't make an assumption as to what the test scores are if they don't appear during a pre-read.
This is some advice I tend to give all my students, athlete or non-athlete. Would you agree with this, Andy? I say even test optional schools still like high scores. So if you have high scores, it is in your best interest to submit them, athlete or non-athlete. Fair?
Yes.
And I know that gets complicated because people are like, gotcha, thought you were test optional.
No,
but,
and
so it's tricky, right? But I get it.
About
you get
the time you witnessed me getting into a Twitter fight with somebody.
Yeah, boy, you got a good memory.
They submitted test scores, and the test scores were good.
Yes.
But the test scores were not as good as the data we saw in the transcript. So we reached out to the student and advised them, like, by the way, you'd actually be better off by waiving this test scores. And it had nothing to do with us gaming the system. It had everything to us to do trying to maximize this student's profile. But we've actually moved this year to essentially a do no harm test policy
Oh,
where
that's
we
good.
say
That's
on the front
catching
end,
on, isn't it?
exactly.
Colorado College does it.
Yep.
Chicago, TCU. I'm really seeing that catch on.
Exactly. We're like, listen, we're only going to use your test scores. Even if you ask us to look at them, we're only going to use them if it helps your profile. So therefore, we don't get caught in this trap of like writing a student an email and saying, hey, by the way, you'd be better off by waiving your test scores. So in this case, 100%. If you have high test scores, sure, send them in. Everybody loves them. If we find that your transcript is a better data point for us, we're just going to ignore them and keep them in our file, and that'll help your reader rating. It'll help your pre-read. It may help a merit scholarship later on down the road. So we've adopted this do no harm thing because we got tired of wading into this, morass of, wait a minute, you're just waiving my test scores so you can look good for U.S. News. And it's like, no, that's not how we roll.
So, one thing I realized we haven't talked about, Andy, the timing. Well, help walk people through the timing of when these pre-reads happen.
No, it's the Wild West, man. I'm telling you, the pre-read is. I mean, we'll have institutions who are doing pre-reads and extending offers to students in the spring semester of a student's junior year. And in the NESCAC, I would make two comments. One, we talk about this regularly because there is some concern that we're losing great student athletes because so-and-so was able to offer them early. And our timeline on pre-reads is really firm in the NESCAC. The coaches submit them on June 15th. We can then communicate the results of a pre-read to coaches on July 1st, and coaches are not allowed to discuss the results of a pre-read with a student athlete until I think noon on July 1st. So that's one concern, is that we're worried about losing great student athletes to a particular institution because they don't live under the same timeline we do. But the other concern that we have, and this is something we're sensitive to at really highly selective places, is the slightly different calendars that exist for a student athlete versus a non-student athlete. A student athlete, and I'm thinking of, were you at Westtown when Mo Bamba was there?
No, he was after me, but of course I followed it closely.
Yeah, he was offered at Harvard because Tommy Amaker was the coach at Harvard. I think he ended up at Texas for a year before going to the NBA, right?
Exactly. Yep, Texas.
But he was probably, quote unquote, offered at Harvard at some point during his junior year. And a regular student who applies for admission to Harvard isn't going to find out until December of their senior year.
Yeah.
So you end up with two,
at the earliest,
sometimes subtly, but sometimes vastly different timelines. So in the NESCAC, we have some concerns about, the different calendars that exist, but, it's the Wild West when it comes to the timelines surrounding pre-reads, that coaches will be asking for them very, very early. NESCAC coaches may be asking for them very early, but we can't start reviewing them until June 15th before the student's senior year of high school. So our timeline across the NESCAC, which is 11 schools, is really firm and set, but it's going to differ for other institutions and other leagues, without a doubt.
And if the term NESCAC's new for you listeners, it's just the New England Small College Athletic Conference. It's a group of highly selective schools in New England that are on the same conference, mostly liberal arts and science schools, smaller, I guess Tufts being the biggest one.
Yep.
And it's one of the most competitive of the D3 conferences.
Correct.
So who are all the people involved in a pre-read?
Really, and again, at the Division III level, it's largely going to be either the head coach or an assistant coach who's the recruiting coordinator, and then the liaison. And sometimes it gets bumped up to the director of admission or the dean, the person who makes the actual admission decisions. I think at some highly selective D1s, you're going to be dealing with extra layers of athletic administration. And this is kind of where the Varsity Blues scandal went off the rails, because coaches were dealing with sometimes a higher level person in the athletic department who was communicating pre-reads to the admission office, and the admission office was communicating back to that athletic administrator. And as a result, there was a point of weakness there where you could corrupt one person and therefore influence an admission process. But it's D3 places I've been. It's the head coach or the recruiting coordinator who's an assistant coach directly to the liaison in the admission office. And then that communication goes one way for the pre-read stuff and then straight back with the evaluation of the pre-read.
Friends, this concludes part 2 of the conversation I'm having with Andy Stricker about how athletic recruiting works at selective institutions. We hope you join us next week for part 3.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
All right, Julia, I'm going to play this question and just dive right in, and we'll take Lara's question from Pennsylvania. Here we go.
Hello, YCBK crew. Thank you so much for your podcast. I've been listening every week for the past few months, and I've found it so helpful. My name is Lara, and I live in a suburb of Philadelphia. I have 2 kids in high school, one finishing their junior year, and the other is finishing their freshman year. Our school, a public high school, offers both honors and AP classes. The school does not assign any weight to the grades that students receive in honors and AP classes, and they insist that this will not negatively impact admissions of students because the colleges will know that about our school. I know that colleges get the school profile, so they'll see my kids' grades in context, and I know that rigor is important, and schools say that they recalculate grades because there's a wide range in grading systems, but what I can't wrap my head around is how the really big schools handle this. How does a school like a Penn State or a Michigan, which had over 100,000 applications this past cycle, how do they go through and recalculate everyone's GPA? How do they have the time to do that? I'm worried that my son's grades in his honors and AP classes, which are good, but they aren't all A's and A pluses, will cause his entire application to be overlooked at some of the more selective flagship schools he's interested in. Can you help alleviate my fears or give me some good information to go to our college counselor at their school with? Thanks so much.
Well, first, Lara, shout out to say hello to Philadelphia for me.
For both of us.
Yeah.
I had 14 years there.
Yeah. I don't know if you're Delco or Montco, Lara, but we all love it.
Yeah.
So this is a great question. And actually, I've gotten this question before from parents is that so a few things are at play when high school doesn't weight a GPA even when they've got honors and AP courses is you're correct that a college usually does its own calculation. In fact, a school that I did outside reading for, that was my primary job, is that I took a weighted or unweighted GPA, whatever they gave to me, and I just made our own GPA right out of that.
Can you explain to our listeners why schools do that, Julia?
Yeah, so the problem is there's so many different systems out there, and it's especially when you do work for a school that gets far more than 15,000 applications, that you need to find a way to standardize it. This is really this is the idea behind the SRAR, the self-reported academic record, and also the University of California system, is that there's too many transcripts that are on different weight systems. Some have GPAs, some don't. Sometimes
and some have scales out of 1 to 11 and 1 through 7 and 1 through 5 and 1 through 9.
Yep. And some do like half a weight for an AP, some do a whole point. So there's no way, it's not.
Or some weight dual enrollment and some don't. Some weight honors in advance, some don't. Yeah.
Right. Some weight arts courses, some don't. And so it is not a standard metric. And therefore it is the college needs to decide for itself, how do we standardize this? So that way we can compare apples to apples and not apples to oranges. And so, for example, the school that I did processing of transcripts for is that there was a very specific set of rules. When we created a GPA, we only looked at certain classes. We gave certain weights to certain things. So that was how we were able to really decide if a student, based on what it is. I've read schools where somebody has a 4.07 GPA. And if I did a quick look at that, I'm like, wow, that's really good. That's actually like bottom because it's out of like a 5.2 or something like that. So do not fear is what I have to say about your child's high school not weighting that, because not only will a college do that, but I'm even talking about the schools that do have over 100,000 applications. Almost all of these schools either have what are kind of called processors. So these are people or machines that their sole function is just to grab a transcript and then put it into a number that makes sense for the reader ultimately. And that's what the University of California system does. It's an algorithm, right? So a computer like has taken the standardized information that you input, right? Because they've standardized it for you. So that happens on the other end. I will say this too, Lara. I have only a couple times come up to the point where a school that does accept does get over 100,000 applications did misread the transcript, right? Did not, whatever it was, whatever standardization they did not accurately reflect my student. I'll totally out this school, University of Alabama. It is the bane of most college counselors' existence because I even had 3 students one year apply, and all, even from the same school, all 3 of them got different distinctions on how their GPA was calculated. But I'll say this, I called them and I cleared it up. So that was fine. So there are a handful of some schools that I suppose that is possible. I would always say it is within your right to, if you really feel like something was really miscalculated, you can always usually ask like, hey, what did my GPA come out to be? Or were you aware of this, and this? So it is totally fine. However, your high school presents a weighted or unweighted GPA or whatever they're presenting is going to be changed by the college anyway. So for sure, your children are not at a disadvantage. I actually work at a school now that does weight very differently for an honors or an AP, but then they changed weighting to no longer include A pluses. And so everyone's got a different GPA, even if they took the same courses. So it is, you're totally fine. You don't have to worry about it. And I would very much venture to guess that your guidance counselor or college counselor at your child's school already knows about this. So you don't need to necessarily go back to them with this information.
Yeah. And I know that, Lara, she emphasized the big schools because, like she said, she can't get her hand around the 100,000, type apps. And so, yeah, you mentioned automation when I interviewed Andy Borst on AI. He talked about that's one thing schools are using to do some of that processing. The other thing is, like Julia talked about processors. Some schools call them pre-readers. Some schools, there's the seasonal reps. So what you see at a lot of the big schools is hiring a lot of seasonal reps.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the UCs have 200 seasonal reps.
Yeah. I think Michigan has something like 150, I heard, or something like that.
Yes. Yeah. And so when you look at a seasonal rep, they don't get paid that much. Like 25 an hour. Some pay less. Some pay 17.
I was not paid 25 an hour.
17. I've seen 17. I've seen 17 an hour before.
It's low.
So they're not paid that much. The reason why I'm going into this is I'm trying to let you know a little bit how the money piece can work. So let's say you have a seasonal where you paid more or less than that, Julia. Can I ask that?
I had $20 an hour.
Yeah.
But granted, this was like 10 years ago. So
sure. So 25, 20. I've seen as low as 17 and I've seen as high as 30, and I'm sure I don't know what everybody pays, but the point is they're not paid that much.
Right. So
let's go with 25 an hour. So let's say the seasonal reader let's say they're working 30 hours a week. Let's just say it's 30 hours a week. So 25 times 30 is $750.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's $750 for the week. And let's say, how many weeks should I estimate that seasonals work, would you say, Julia, for the whole year?
Sometimes it's like 2 weeks. Sometimes at most it's like 7 weeks. But also most of the seasonal reps are capped at hours, right? You're doing like 4 hours of reading and your 4 hours of processing, and you're expected to get so many done because they don't want to be paying you more money than they already are.
Yeah. So let's say the total reading time is 8 weeks. So if you times 750 times 8, you're talking about $6,000 total that somebody would get for the whole entire year.
Right. No benefits, nothing.
Yeah, and no benefits, no benefits at all. And so, but there's a lot of people out there that are willing to do it. Like I can do, I don't have to come in office. I can do it from home. I can, you know what I mean? Like Julia's done it on the side as a side hustle.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And so all of a sudden financially, you can see how a school can like potentially have quite a few seasonals.
Right.
that can help them with the processing. And you do tend to see the growth of the seasonals at the larger schools with a lot of admit rates.
Right.
I mean, Rick Clark from Georgia Tech that talked about how they went from 6 and then they got to 15 and 20. They got up to as high as 60 at one point. And like I said, there are places that have well over 100 and even pushing 200. And so between using seasonals, using processors, using pre-reader, and some people, it's just only their job is just to go through and to calculate, like to recalculate. Like
Yep.
That's not it. They're not even reading the file and rating and all that. They're just exclusively standardizing stuff.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And so that's a big way that schools can do it that are larger, and make it work within their budget. And, there are a lot of places where you'll see schools advertise for that. I actually encourage people now, not just even doing the GPA calculations, and the reconversion is a good thing. But if you can get into seasonal reading, I think it's a really good thing for somebody to get some experience with file reading that can really help them understand things. I know it's just one school and different schools do it differently, but I think that can be good training for a counselor that doesn't have the opportunity to get to go be paid as a full-time rep that gets to have a territory and travel with benefits. And if you can't, that's not the easiest thing for somebody to do at 42, decides that, I kind of like this a lot and maybe I want to better understand this process, whether it's for your own kid or a school counselor job or an independent counselor job, whatever it is. I think it's some of the better training that's out there to at least be able to understand how how things work at different places.
Yeah. And it usually happens, your reading happens over your breaks often. If you're a school-based counselor or just within the, I did a lot of reading over my winter break from school. Right. So.
Cool. Anything else we want to share in this, Julia?
Last thing real quick is this is why we are seeing the rise of the SRAR, particularly at colleges that do have over 100,000 applications. So that's your NYU, that's your, I know these are private colleges, but USC really had to do it as well because the University of California system, so many people are applying to that who apply to USC that they can't possibly expect students to actually produce a transcript because they're not used to doing that and sending it to a college. NYU uses the SRAR. So this is a standardized way where the student inputs their transcript into their
self-reported academic record.
Yes.
Right? So, yeah. Awesome. Julia, thank you. As always, I appreciate you. Thank you, listeners. Thank you, Lara.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, it's the third part of my interview with Carlynn Greene, also known as the Scholarship Guru and author of the book, The Scholarship Algorithm. In part 3, Carlynn gives us many different tips when it comes to getting reference letters, also known as letters of recommendation. Carlynn defines scholarship displacement, and she shares some tips to help students avoid getting their scholarship displaced. Carlynn talks about whether it's important for a student to be involved in service and philanthropy. Carlynn talks to us about sweepstakes scholarships, and I share what I like about Bold.org and Going Merry when it comes to searching for scholarships. Carlynn shares her thoughts on Scholly. Carlynn shares tips about staying organized. Carlynn talks about some of the resources that she has on her website that students can use, and she lets us know what her website is. And then Carlynn talks about what she covers in her book, The Scholarship Algorithm. And finally, Carlynn shares some of the other services she offers. Listen and enjoy. Let's talk about recommendations, because this is a question I get a lot. If I'm going to apply to 10 scholarships, do I have to ask someone to write 10 recommendations for me? I mean, I don't want to ask someone to write 10 recommendations. So what's your advice for somebody when it comes to scholarship recommendations?
Yes. Oh, gosh, that is such a great question. So letters of recommendations, aka reference letters, they are the second most important part of your application. And so you want to have letters coming from like a counselor, teacher, professor, employer, someone at an internship that you perhaps did or eventually will do.
Sometimes students are concerned. They said, if I apply to 10 scholarships, I can't ask somebody to write 10 recommendations. So how do I navigate that process?
Yes. So basically, what you want to do is have access to that specific letter recommendation that someone wrote to you in PDF format, and possibly get their permission to modify it based off of who your specific audience is for that scholarship that you're applying for in the future, right? So this is what I had to do. Since I applied for a little over 100 scholarships, it would make no sense for me to constantly reach out to the same exact people who wrote my letters initially and say, hey, can you write a new one? Or hey, can you go in and submit this for me? When there was an option oftentimes for me to just submit it on their behalf. So please, please, please do this, because the last thing you want to do is to annoy the people who took the time out of their day to put these letters of recommendation together for you. And it also helps to have a variety of letters of recommendation, right? So one could be like from a professor, one from someone who you had employment with, whether that's like a traditional job, internship, and another one could even come from like a coworker or a fellow classmate. And I would more so say classmates if you're already in university, if you're already in college. So for instance, my strongest letter recommendation actually came from someone who was a graduate student at the time, and I was a sophomore. So we did this final group project together within our 8-hour course relating to journalism. It was basically like a simulation of what you would expect behind the scenes. And we do rotational things where one day you would be the graphics person, another day the producer, and so forth. But anywho, the final project was to create our own original show, right? And my classmate, in her letter, she essentially compared me to Oprah. She was like, it felt like she was working for Oprah with how we went about our show. And we ended up getting the highest grade ever out of all the years that specific course had been taught, that specific lesson project. And so if you have someone who can really show how if you have someone who can really communicate how you have been able to go above and beyond with your work, how passionate you are, then definitely make sure to reach out to that person, have them write a letter. And oftentimes that person will be someone who works more closely with you, which might be like a coworker or a fellow classmate, as opposed to like a professor.
No, that's very, very helpful. Let's talk a little bit about scholarship displacement, everyone's biggest fear. We've been talking on the podcast about it fairly recently. First of all, can you define scholarship displacement in case people didn't hear those episodes we did? And any tips on how a student can avoid having their scholarships get displaced?
Yes, so scholarship displacement is basically when your existing aid is replaced by your incoming aid. So let's say you already have grant money, right? But then you get an external scholarship, but instead of them just adding that money to your account, they just exchange it, exchanging free money with free money, which totally defeats the purpose of trying to win a scholarship in the first place, right? So there are some ways where you can potentially avoid this from happening to you. So for one, you could ask if there's an option to defer the aid that you have received to another year, another semester when you would need that financial aid more. You could also ask for the money to be sent to you directly, like within your bank account, as opposed to your student account at your specific school. And then you could also ask, well, you can also see if your school has what's called a cost of attendance adjustment form. So essentially with the adjustment form, you would be increasing the overall cost of attendance for that specific school year. And because there's now this excess amount relating to the COA, which is short for cost of attendance, then the scholarship money that you just received can be used for that purpose. And so with the cost of attendance adjustment form, it might say, how do you plan to like use this excess amount of financial aid, right? And so it might say, oh, I need to use this aid for getting something relating to my education, like a new camera, new equipment, materials, whatever it may be. You just have to justify as to why you need to increase your cost of attendance.
Yeah, and the student I worked with this year who won 12, she ended up doing both of the things you said. She got close to about $5,000 to be, deferred to the following year, working with the scholarship committees and asking if they could just apply them to a different year. And then she also did the cost of living adjustment form and was able to get some additional expenses. I can't remember, but I know I've had people in the past that have got it for for like computer equipment, showing that your travel expenses are higher than what the estimates are, and various things. So so she worked both of those angles. So those are great. Those are great ideas. Those are great tips. So, Carlynn, how important do you feel things like community service are, or evidence that somebody is sort of philanthropically oriented, and having that come through in a scholarship application? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, that is very important to have. It gives you a leg up against your competition. I would say 9 times out of 10 when I'm looking over like applications from those who did win scholarships, they are wanting to pay it forward in some capacity, in some way. Because the last thing you want for your essay to read like is essentially like a resume, just stating that, oh, you've accomplished this, you did that, giving the stats on what you have done. Of course, you want to implement those certain things, but you also want to humanize your application. And often, in order to humanize your application, it really does help to showcase how you want to help others.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
Friends, the recommended resource for episode 459 is something you just heard Julie and I discuss. SRAR, also known as SRAR, also known as the Self-Reported Academic Record. Essentially, it asks students to report their own entire high school transcripts themselves in a specific format. And it's something that is growing to address some of the things Julie and I just talked about, the standardizing the process of seeing transcripts from schools all over the country, and also reducing some of the work on the part of schools by passing this on to students. I was talking to a student of mine and their mom recently, and he said that thing was a pain. It took us 2 hours to do that. So what is the recommended resource? The recommended resource is a video produced by the University of Illinois that answers pretty much all the frequently asked questions you would have about SRAR or SAR. I personally needed it myself because I get asked questions about SAR that I don't know the answers to. I actually had one this week from a student from Kennett Square, Pennsylvania. I never worked with it when I was on the school side. It's really, I don't know if it's 6, 7 years old now, but it just trickled in then. Each year it's picking up steam. The whole process of how schools get transcripts is pretty complicated, when you look at it, because some schools, they ask students to use the courses and grades feature, which is one of the 7 components of Common App, but it's a minority of schools that do that. In some cases, school counselors are sending the transcript in, and on the school side, they're doing the things that Julie and I discussed with their processors or pre-readers or seasonals or to standardize things, and in some cases, they're putting it back on the student, but not through courses and grades, but through SAR, SRAR, Self-Reported Academic Record. Chances are quite high that your student will have at least one school that's going to ask for SAR. And it's kind of a mess on the counseling side. People hate it. And so you really do need a good video to explain how it works and answer all your frequently asked questions. And that's the recommended resource. And so we'll put the link in the show notes and check it out. I know I personally used it and it helped me. I think it can help you. What are your thoughts on these? Sometimes people call them sweepstakes scholarships, where, all you do is put your name, no work, this, the other, and they promise the world. Do you have any thoughts on them?
Yeah, so those are legitimate opportunities, but 9 times out of 10, I do not really recommend applying to them because your chances of winning are slim to none. When I first started applying for scholarships back when I didn't really know what I was really doing, I applied for a lot of those and I never got anything besides like a whole bunch of promotional emails, because basically with those type of scholarships, they're trying to get you into their email newsletter, right? So they can send you all this promotional material, and you're not really interested in that. You want money for college. And so it's very important to mainly focus on scholarships that at least require an essay, and if not that, something that can supplement for an essay. So like a video application. I'm seeing a lot more scholarships lately requiring a video as opposed to an essay, or at least in addition to an essay, or perhaps it requires instead like a resume and work portfolio. But if an application like the sweepstakes scholarships are only requiring like your name and your email and nothing much really to assess like your merits and your personality and things like that, then that opportunity is probably not really worth your time applying to.
Yeah, no, I agree. Maybe they give a few away, but then they're selling your names to other people in databases and you get blitzed with all this mail. I've discouraged those. Some people I know go so far as to say don't even apply to a scholarship if there's not an essay. Do you think that's too far, or would you agree with that?
I wouldn't necessarily say that because, again, these opportunities often are legitimate. You're just less likely to win if it doesn't at least require something like an essay or something that supplements like a video. But I will say with bold.org specifically, right, a lot of their scholarships are no essay, right? But technically they are requiring an essay, because instead of you submitting like a separate essay, the judges are judging you based off what is written within your profile. So like your about you section, which essentially supplements as like a personal statement, if you will. So even though they say no essay scholarships on Bold, technically they kind of still are.
Yeah, friends, and if you're not familiar with bold.org or Going Merry, like I love the concept they've come up with. In some ways, it's almost like the Common App concept, where they gather this information into a portal and you have all of this information you fill out, but then you can see like what scholarships you match with, rather than having to constantly reduplicate all of the stuff that, you may get tired of putting in for each individual scholarship. So I think it's a good sign of innovation. There's a lot of national stuff out there. There's like the Fast Webs, and there's, what's the guy from Louisiana who started that app and went to Penn and he went out? Yeah, Scholly. What are your thoughts on like Scholly and Fast Web and stuff like that?
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, Scholly previously you had to pay for in order to access, but then it was acquired by Sallie Mae and now their platform is free. Fact check me on that, but I think that's how it is now.
Mm-hmm. I know it definitely used to be a monthly. There definitely was like a $1 or $2 or $3.99 app fee a month. I remember those days. So you taught me something I didn't know. Any thoughts on organization, tools, tips for organization?
Yes, so I primarily use like Google Drive, Google Docs, Google Sheets. I'm all about Google. I credit Google with so much. Even with a lot of the scholarships.
Cutting you a check.
Yeah. Even with a lot of the scholarships I won, I found via Google. They should do a brand deal with me at this point, honestly. But so on my website, I have a lot of free resources and like spreadsheet templates that you can use. Like, for instance, a scholarship organizer spreadsheet that's via Google Sheets is very easy and accessible to use. So I definitely recommend downloading what's titled My Financial Aid Toolkit on my website when you get the chance to. And then I even have some other spreadsheets and templates you can refer to within another free resource on my website called My Student Success Toolkit. And that's very helpful because one of the resources in there shows like various platforms where you can bulk apply to university. So like not only the Common App, but there's other platforms that are similar. Like, for instance, if you're trying to go to HBCU, there's a Common App for that. Or there's even certain Common Apps for graduate level, for grad school. And I have all of these resources located within that specific toolkit. So definitely check it out.
Yeah, let's talk about your resources. Carlynn, I know you've given us some of the free resources on your website, and say your website one more time.
Yes. So my website is called scholarship-guru.com.
I also want to put a plug in for your book, and I thank you for sending me a copy of it. So talk to us about scholarship algorithm. I know the student that I worked with credited that book. I mean, this is almost one of the best compliments. She said, the book almost worked too well. Like that's like a really nice thing to say. So talk to us about scholarship algorithm. If somebody was to purchase that, what they could expect to learn in that book and how they could go about getting a copy.
Yes, so my book is basically my step-by-step process on how I've been able to win all these scholarships over the years and how I've been able to help other students win scholarships across the globe. So not only here in the US, but other countries as well. So whether you're wanting to study in the States or go abroad, it's going to be, I hope it is also helpful for you. And basically the book is broken up into 4 sections. The first part of the book talks about how to find scholarships you're more likely to win. Second part discusses optimization and organization, so like how to get organized with applying and getting all your paperwork and centralized, right? Third section covers how to write an effective scholarship essay, how to really get into like the minds of your reader, like implementing psychology practices, right? And then the final part of the book discusses how to put together an overall effective application. So the other materials that go into it, for instance, like your resume, work portfolio, and so forth. So it gives you a step-by-step process. But yeah, it's a very short read. Honestly, you can get through reading it about like 2 or 3 days. I was intentional with writing it this way because I know already college and scholarship applications can be very overwhelming, and the last thing I wanted was to overwhelm people even more. So that's how and why I wrote it like that.
Now, in addition to your book, you do both one-on-one scholarship coaching and you have a class as well, right? Tell me about those opportunities.
Yes, so I do one-on-one coaching, whether that's like a 15-minute call, a 30-minute call, and then I have a program, an online course by the same title as my book, The Scholarship Algorithm. So with the main difference between the book versus the program is that the program goes a lot more into detail. Like it thoroughly analyzes my winning applications, the winning applications of others I've helped over the years, whether they were in high school, undergrad, or grad school. And it gives a lot more tips that are not already seen within the book. And then you have all of my services bundled in with the program. So like the one-on-one calls, essay editing, interview coaching, because some scholarships require an interview phase. Or let's say you're wanting to practice for interviewing for like a certain position on campus. Like for instance, if you're wanting to work in housing, I previously worked in housing my junior and senior year. I was an RA, resident assistant, that fully paid for my housing and meal plan. So with the program, you could do interview coaching for me to help prep for that and hopefully get the same benefits that I did. And then you would also have like priority access to my time and schedule, right? And then another benefit of the program is that even if you have like multiple kids, or perhaps like you as a parent and you as a student are wanting to enroll in the program, there's no extra cost. It's not like you have to have separate accounts. You can all just be on the same account.
Cool. And do you do speaking engagements as well?
Yeah, so I've done a lot of speaking engagements. I've spoken at like the NAACP conference, various universities, community colleges across the nation. I'm trying to do even more of that, especially with social media being so unpredictable, right? Like you can have one day a video go viral, but then the next day it flops. So I can't be solely dependent on social media to get my message out there. And a lot of people are not even on social media to begin with. So it's important to engage with people in person as well. And then I also occasionally do like table at college expos, and I might speak there if they have like a seminar session at the expo. And I even give out scholarships. I've given out scholarships for students with disabilities, a scholarship for paying off student loan debt, and all these other opportunities. So I do a lot, and I just try to variate all the ways in which I help to reach as many people as possible.
Awesome. Friends, this concludes the third part of my interview with Carlynn Greene. We hope you join us next week for the final part.
And now it's time for our College Spotlight of the Week.
Friends, Kevin Newton's doing a 4-part series for us looking at universities in London. And, the two of us have already decided that he's going to come back and actually do 2 more segments. They're according to Kev, and he's our expert. You can group universities in London into 4 categories. And we're going to cover 3 of the 4 in this series. And then he'll come back and take the last category, and that'll be a 2-parter. And so you can look for that later in the end of 2024. But this is part 2 of 4. If you missed part 1, we encourage you to go back, listen, and enjoy.
But I want to be careful here and say, while the University of London's a great umbrella, and there are advantages to being part of the University of London, or being a graduate of there, or even a student of there. You get the alumni network that stretches across, around the world, really. The University of London Union, the student union, is one of the best in the UK. They have the biggest swimming pool in London, unless some billionaire has built something new in Chelsea that we just don't know about yet. And you've got the opportunity to, in a lot of cases, depending on your program, take classes at other universities. But I want to be very careful not to cast shade on any university that's not part of the University of London, but that's still in Greater London. And there are 2 that in particular I'm really fond of. And those are the University of Westminster and the University of Greenwich. Westminster is phenomenal for a lot of things. What it stands out to me, again, being the language nerd I am, is they've got one of the best Chinese programs in the UK. Greenwich, on the other hand, it's because not everything is just academics. It's still quite good school, but it is one of the most beautiful campuses in the whole of Europe. It's located in one of the former naval academies in the UK. One of the central buildings is referred to as Queen's House. In fact, I believe, I could be wrong here, that our White House was modeled on it. It's right there near the Greenwich Observatory. It's in a small village that's still in downtown, or essentially in downtown London. You can see the skyline from the top of the hill. So a lot of students who maybe want the convenience of being in London or very close to London, knowing that they can get to the British Museum in 30 minutes, or that they can get to their internship downtown in 15 minutes, but want someplace that's not as high pressure as, say, and not even from the academics, but from the sheer environment. Some people like wide open green spaces, and some people like the idea of going to a market on a Saturday morning and buying a breakfast sandwich and a cup of coffee and just wandering around. Greenwich is that. It's anytime we go to London to this day, the absolute top of my wife's agenda is to catch the ferry leaving from either Westminster or the Tower of London, sit on it for the 30 minutes or hour, depending on where we depart from, and just go spend a day in Greenwich, because it's such a different environment. It's very relaxing.
Kev, going back and looking at these versus the sweatshirt schools, is everybody here all on UCAS? Is everyone using UCAS for all these applications?
Absolutely.
Okay, so it's all UCAS. Mm-hmm.
It's just you type in the name of the university and select the program.
And are there any other differences besides the most elite and this group, besides difficulty of admission?
I mean, you're always going to have, I feel, those differences that you would have between the sweatshirt universities and then those universities that I feel so many of us are like, you should really consider,
Sure.
alongside.
Are these younger? Because sometimes that cachet is highly correlated to how long a school's been around. Or are these schools also ones that are like 500 years old?
Well, that's kind of what's interesting, is that, of the University of London schools, or the schools in Greater London, the oldest one is UCL, which I think is 1836 or something like that. It's higher education in the UK was a product of the church for so long that it was really only in the 19th century that we saw this desire to expand out.
So it's not like Scotland. It's different. They're very much different than Scotland.
I mean, the Scottish universities, you look at the list of, the oldest universities in the English-speaking world, which, yes, as a William and Mary alum, I pretty much have memorized at this point.
Sure you are. Those of you who don't know, Kevin went to William and Mary, which is the second oldest college in the United States, 1693, I think?
1693. In fact, there's a plaque on the Wren building that says we're the second oldest university in America. Penn wants to fight over that, but that's a conversation for a different day. But then says, but first in its antecedents, William and Mary is literally trying to claim they were talked about before Harvard was talked about. So I don't think that
Well,
matters in the grand scheme of things. I don't think that helps, but
well, the only time I've really felt I've ever really, really rankled you was when I referred to William and Mary as the third oldest. You set me straight really fast.
it is. It's just like a knee kick thing. Like, it's woe behold anyone who spells out the word and in William and Mary. It is the ampersand. Like that thing is on baseball caps. I'm pretty sure my wife has one because she's more obsessed with the place than I am, but it is, it is a quirky place.
Cool. So did we cover everything in the second tier, or is there more you want to say about this group?
I really want to kind of emphasize there, and that if you're looking for a place, and whether you want the competition of the LSE, UCL, King's, Imperial, some people include Queen Mary in that, some don't. It just depends on, kind of where you're at. You can find just about anything you're looking for. If, you can find the super urban downtown environment, or you can find something that's a lot more laid back. And, when we get into admissions requirements, there are places that will admit you, quite good places that will admit you based off your high school GPA and your ACT or SAT. Unfortunately, we don't see a lot of test optional now that the pandemic's over, but it's just, as I think we talked about before, a lot of these places don't really have a good measuring stick of how a high school, say, in Northern Virginia stacks up to a high school in, say, West Texas. So they use that to some degree. Obviously, a lot of mixed emotions about that, but I just wanted to explain a little bit of the logic. But what you'll find is those test scores do tend to be a little lower than what you would expect elsewhere, and they're really just minimums for the test scores.
Let's talk about admissions, because I'm sure a lot of people are listening, and this is just something everybody looks at and listens completely through the framework of their own lens, right? Our audience, as you know, is mostly parents, and so there'll be some people who will listen to this who are just intellectually curious. They just would like to know more about other schools in the world, whether they're college counselors or just parents who like to be informed. Then there's another person that's listening and thinking, I wonder if that could be something my kid could be interested in or could be a good fit. So I think it's helpful for people to sort of have a framework of what's a competitive applicant. How's the assessment judged? I'm sure it's very similar to what you've said in the past, right? Is it mostly transcript, GPA, SAT, AP scores? Is that it? And if there's any writing, it's focused on tell me why you want to major, what you want to major in? Is that the framework for the most part?
Essentially, yeah. So it does differ depending on where you apply, based off of whether you need the APs, whether you don't need the APs, and what GPA you need. There are certainly places that will accept in London with a 3.0 unweighted GPA and an ACT score in the mid-20s, which, there are some pretty good places. There's some pretty remarkable places that will do that. The main thing, again, is why are you wanting to study this? It's not enough to say, I feel I have to go to college, so why not go to London?
Let's get into that, because I think all these things are important. From GPA, I want to ask you some more GPA questions, and then I want to ask you a couple more questions about the why you want to study what you want to study. So for GPA, Kev, over here it's very common in the U.S. for schools to differentiate between several things, right? Between your academic GPA and then your cumulative GPA. Academic GPA being math, English, science, social studies, foreign language. Cumulative counting the cooking class and in counting the art and the dance class. So are they focused? Do they make that differentiation when you talk GPA? Is it core classes, and is it 5 core? Because I've seen some places where foreign language is not in that 5. So is it the same big 5 that are used here? Like what subjects are they using when they talk GPA? And then my second question, are they looking mostly at weighted or unweighted?
It's typically going to be an unweighted cumulative GPA. That said, it's always a good idea to make sure you've got those standard 4 years of English, 3 or 4 years of math, 3 or 4 years of science, 3 or 4 years of social studies, and at least at the places that actually look at it, because I know we've had students get in trouble with this in the past with Irish universities, 3 years of a foreign language. That said, something that UCAS has really started pushing this year is that they want you to, or in the recommendation section, they want to know more about the school you went to. So if you're going to a small school, say, like where I grew up in East Tennessee, where there might be 2 AP classes that they just teach, so you look good to, the University of Tennessee or to Georgia or whoever, and you excel at that, they're going to take that into account. It's not going to be quite the same as if you were knocking everyone's socks off at TJ in Fairfax, but you're going to be doing okay. To give you just kind of a range of what we're talking about here in terms of where you can get in, I mentioned the University of Greenwich earlier, which, again, no one's really going to turn their head negatively at Greenwich. And, if you show up with a 3.2 GPA, you're quite competitive there. In fact, for a number of degree options, they will waive the ACT or SAT requirement. And this goes a little bit a place like Greenwich or Westminster that's not within the University of London, but still, I want to emphasize is in the ways that matter, quite the equal to many of those institutions. They want the diversity of having an American voice on campus. They really do. So, even if you have like a 2.8 GPA, they want you to have a 22 on your ACT or a 1050 on your SAT. Again, there's going to be some variation there. But if we look at a more competitive course, so not to go back to SOAS, but to go back to SOAS, because, that's what I'm constantly trying to convince my wife to let me do, is their law program is one of the top 10 in the UK. And they've got a number of different requirements. If you have a 3.2 GPA and a 1300 SAT and a number of APs, you're good. If you have a 3.4 GPA and a couple of APs, you're good. If you don't have any APs and you've got a 3.6 and a 1380 or a 30 on your ACT, you're good. So they really do try to give you various points of entry. Something else that's interesting, because a lot of students...
Can I follow up with you on
Sure.
that question? My mind can't help but go here. If they're looking at cumulative, unweighted, and they're not making the differentiation between academic classes, and so the cooking class just factors in just like any other class, if somebody's on the borderline and they know about all this in the past, why would they not say, you know what, this is kind of an easy A over here. This class is going to help my chances. It feels like what I'm hearing from you is you could kind of get away with that at some of these schools and have it work to your benefit.
To some degree, yeah.
I mean, I realize everything I said just makes every educator, just complete nails on a chalkboard.
Nope.
Total cringe. I get it. I'm just talking strategy. I'm not talking love of learning, and you'll benefit so much more by taking the hard class and the exposure to it and developing grit and resilience. I get all that, right? So just purely strategy. Thoughts?
I think you got two different approaches here. If you're taking, the cooking class or the gym class, it's going to be a wash. I mean, but if you're sitting here as someone who wants to go in and study history, and you're like, my senior year, I can either take an additional, say, physics class or anatomy class or whatever people take senior year now, or I can take a geography class or a European history class or something like that. If the easier class is at all focused on your field, if it's easier because it's interesting to you rather than it's just an easier class, and that can be painted with a very broad brush, because I don't think there are that many of us who are going to say world geography is always going to be harder than, say, physics or chemistry. Right. It can sincerely play to your advantage, because what use does a historian have to understand perpetual motion or stoichiometry? My mother-in-law, the rocket scientist, is cringing right now as I say that. But
I'm sure. I have a couple follow-up questions. So you know how you were before saying you could have a 3.2 and a 25 and a, so is that a grid that's out there that's published and is available to the public? Kind of like some schools do that, right? Like,
yes,
that's very commonly done here in Georgia public schools outside of the three or four most selective ones. They have they have the formulaic method. And you'll see that with places like Iowa and several other schools do that as well, state schools. So it sounds like that is published and available to the public, and you can kind of just look at test score, GPA metric, and see if you look competitive. That's fair?
exactly.
Can I ask where people can get access to
Oh, of
that, or is
course.
that yeah?
So just honestly, the fastest way to do it is to type in University of wherever or whatever the name of the program is and US admissions. And they're not always the most well formatted. I've got Greenwich and SOAS here because they're kind of the two extremes. You very well may want to look at a program specific. So obviously, the law degree at SOAS being one of its most competitive options is going to be more competitive than, say, the art history program. So that's a good starting point. But something else you'll find is that a lot of these universities outside of the top tier of the Russell group, they're quite happy to consider students with associate's degrees who have done dual enrollment or concurrent enrollment and have finished a degree by the time they graduate. And even if they've just finished a year's worth of academic requirements, they'll factor that in. So we've had some cases in the past where we've had students who it's nothing to bet on. Let me be clear about that. And it varies immensely from university to university. But students who, say, study to get their associate's degree while they're still in high school, and some of these places will even grant them a year of advanced standing. So you can go in year 2 of a 2-year degree. So you're not, I dare say, you're not losing a lot of time in that. Now, not everyone's going to let you do that. And it is by case basis. And you've got to factor in, remember, one of the big structural differences between the UK and the US is where your first year or two here in the US, you're still taking general ed requirements for the most part. At least a lot of students are. Overseas, especially in the UK, you're hitting the ground running. So if it's something that, say, I think we had a case of this happening a couple of years ago. If you've studied a lot of intro to business classes and you're applying for a business administration degree, not anything specialized like finance or marketing or anything like that, just a broad-based business degree, and you can say, hey, well, I was at high school, I was dual enrolled, I took principles of accounting and principles of finance and intro to management and all this, they very well may say, well, we're going to grant you some advanced standing on that. Now, whether or not it makes sense for you to do that differs on everyone's timeline, with regards to internships and things of that nature. But it is something that is more and more British universities are learning how to appeal to Americans. And they know that one of their big selling points is the 3-year degree outside of Scotland versus a 4-year degree. And for a lot of them, especially the non-sweatshirt schools, they're realizing, well, it still gets our goals. It attracts that diverse voice from the United States. It also attracts those American tuition dollars. Let's be pragmatic here. But is it okay? They do the cost benefit. They think it's worth doing. Again, it's not a guaranteed. It's nothing to bet on, but it is something that has happened from time to time.
Friends, this includes part 2 of Kev Newton breaking down universities in London. We hope you'll come back next week for part 3 or 4. Friends, on Monday's episode, I'm going to do something I haven't done in a while. I'm going to sort of give a little bit of a panoramic view of some of the things going on in college admissions. As we've gotten a little bit more creative in our In the News segments on our Thursday's episode, we're not doing some of the deep dives that we've done in the past on contemporary issues. We'll return to that. It's just on a little bit of a hiatus. But there's a lot going on in the world of college admissions. And over the next few weeks, I'll be sharing some of those things with you. And then, friends, we'll have part 2 of 5, Vince's interview with Sarah Lovely, who is an admission expert on all things related to the arts and college admissions. And that's both performing arts and the visual arts. And friends, I just want to let you know we are going to have our roundtable back. We were working together, trying to nail a time down. Very difficult with 5 busy people trying to get a time that works for all of us. But we try to please, and you guys told us you liked the roundtable. But we were texting and come up with a date. No, one of it wouldn't work for one of us. Then another one, date wouldn't work for one of us. We finally got a date to do the recording. And we'll be doing some questions from listeners that you guys sent in, but we'll have multiple voices that will answer them. But within the text group, one of our contributors said, "Sorry, I was so difficult," and I'm like, "All good, we got it done." And then I said something my father said to me, and he used to say this all the time. And he passed 2 years and 2 months ago, but I've been thinking about him a lot lately. And what I said was, "Where there's a will, there's a way." My dad used to always say that to me, "Son, where there's a will, there's a way." So I encourage you to think about that and how you can apply that to your own life. Where there's a will, there's a way. See you on Monday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joyce Ducker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stalianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.